Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for sticking it out with us and being here for our Freedom School. So this is our final our final session of the day. We're going to be talking about book bans, classroom censorship, and how our classrooms in Georgia have become educational battlegrounds for politics and ultra-conservatism. So my name is Sarah Hunt-Blackwell. I'm the First Amendment policy advocate at the ACLU of Georgia. And I like to always kind of start these conversations with some grounding about the First Amendment and go over what the First Amendment covers. So our First Amendment is our rights that protect our expression and the way that we express ourselves. I also like to clarify that First Amendment rights can only be infringed by government entities. So the person sitting next to you or the person on your Facebook page who blocks your comment or deletes you off of their Instagram or their Facebook, they have not infringed your First Amendment right. Your First Amendment right can only be infringed by government entities. If you're on Facebook and you leave a comment on a post that your state senator has left, for example, and then your senator deletes that comment or blocks you from their page, that's a little bit different. That may be a First Amendment right infringement. So just remembering that, your neighbor, your friend, your loved one cannot infringe on your First Amendment rights. The First Amendment protects 5 things that we hold very near and dear to our society and to ultimately the foundation of our democracy. So the First Amendment protects our right to assemble, our right to petition the government, our right to the press, our right of religion, and also our speech rights. Our speech rights are probably the one that everyone is most familiar with, and it is very important, but I always like to remind people that our First Amendment rights do not exist in a silo, meaning that a lot of First Amendment issues that come up are entangled and entwined with other issues that seemingly are unrelated. So if we have a speech issue that's occurring in a classroom, we have now created the larger issue of censorship. We have a First Amendment right with speech. We have our educational rights and our educational access, and then mashing those together, we then create issues of censorship, which is what we will be talking about this evening. So why are we talking about classroom censorship in terms of our rights, in terms of this election and election season? Classroom censorship really is a local issue, but we have to remember that elections play a major role, as many of the school board members and state politicians that obtain their seats through local elections are the ones that are the final decision makers for what happens in our classrooms and what content our students have access to. There are quite a few organizations across the country that are essentially feeding our state legislators and our state senators with bills focused on classroom censorship and focused on limiting what students can access in classrooms. A few of those organizations are on the screen, and these are the organizations that we at the ACLU of Georgia spend a lot of time trying to resist and trying to combat when it's a legislative session down at the Capitol between January and March. Classroom censorship targets one of the most vulnerable populations, our student minors, and tries to control the material that they engage with. Censorship attempts are often masked as protection from non-white, non-cis, heterosexual, non-Christian ideals. And they often scapegoat minority groups and LGBTQ plus communities as harmful to minors and use this as the reasoning to essentially censor and block the content that students access in schools. Again, because your First Amendment right can only be infringed by a government entity, it's important to know that we can only fight censorship that occurs in public schools. And private schools and colleges have more ability to censor the content and the speech that occurs in private spaces. So 2022 was a big year for censorship in the state of Georgia. There were a number of bills that became law. And these bills, we are now starting to kind of see the effects of them. Probably the largest bill, and one that you all may be familiar with, is HB 1084, which is known as the Divisive Concepts Bill. This bill outlined 9 divisive topics, that are not supposed to be instructed on or discussed in schools. Most of these topics dealt with issues of race and racial identity. So a few, or I think all 9 of the divisive concepts are on the screen. So just for example, you cannot teach in classrooms that the United States is fundamentally racist, or that an individual is inherently racist or oppressive because of their race. So seemingly, these concepts have the guise that they are trying to be inclusive, and that they are, trying to create a kind of level playing field in schools. But the underlying message and tone of this bill is one of erasure and censorship. This chills the speech and chills the ability for educators in Georgia's classrooms to be able to accurately teach the histories that have occurred in this country. This bill, we'll get into that a little later. Next is SB 226, which was the book banning bill. If you all don't already know, there are a whole 159 counties in Georgia, right, Rachel? Something like that. And 180 school districts. So there are more school districts in Georgia than there are counties in Georgia. And the SB 226 essentially created or gave each individual school district the responsibility for determining its process for book bans. So essentially, there are 180 different policies across the entire state of Georgia about how books can be removed in schools. This is problematic for a number of reasons. One, because book bans are problematic in and of themselves. Book bans are censorship. Book bans are, again, attempts to erase and censor and handpick, cherry pick what content gets in front of our students and what content doesn't. But also, just from, an administrative perspective, 180 different procedures across every single across every single school district on how these books are removed. So if you have a student who's in Fulton County schools, and there's a system for how books are removed from the libraries in Fulton County, and then your family moves to Cobb County, it's a completely different system there. And another issue with these book bans, and in this bill in particular, is that there is a small but very vocal minority population of parents and, I guess, concerned citizens who are putting forth these proposals to have books removed and to have books banned. The issue with this is that this small yet vocal minority is essentially making a decision for an entire school. So just because one person doesn't want their child to read a certain book that's accessible in the library, they're now making it so that no child in the entire school can read that book either. That's problematic. Then lastly, we have HB 1178, which is the Parents' Bill of Rights. Again, something that was pretty popular in the legislature at the time, because the language of the bill makes it so that parents seemingly have more say over the content and the material that their students have access to. So this is not exclusive to books. This is actual instructional material. So your curriculum, your handouts that your teachers are passing out in class, your lesson plans, things like that. And this bill essentially says that parents have the right to be able to review all of the content that their student has access to in the classroom, and then be able to challenge that content. Again, not just for their child and their student, but for all the students and all the children in the school. So again, a small yet very vocal minority in Georgia, not only in Georgia, but especially across the southern states, are having a major effect of how our students are learning, the history that our students are receiving, and the books and information that our students have access to. So I mentioned before that 2022 was a big year for all of these bills. That was the year that all of these bills were passed. But it's been in the years since that we've seen a lot of kind of what the effects of these bills and what they become and how they manifest in the real world. So HB 1084, the Divisive Concepts Bill, there are two kind of major things that have happened after this bill is passed. So last summer, the board that has essentially the control over our educators and our educators' training in the state of Georgia decided to remove diversity, equity, and inclusion training requirements for all educators in the state of Georgia. They also decided to remove all inclusion and mention of the words diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout every Georgia school. No, I am not kidding. Because of this bill, actually, because of HB 1084. So if it's a domino effect, if it's really kind of like an if-then statement. So if you have a bill that says that you cannot teach about race, then how can you then speak about diversity? It really is a natural, through line if you think about it. And that's why HB 1084 is one of the reasons why HB 1084 is so problematic, because the concept of race and the construct of race is real in this country, and it always has been. And so to try and ignore it and to act like it's not a thing in classrooms and just in everyday life is so unrealistic and problematic. And so that's when we get into these issues of literally trying to erase the existence of diversity, trying to erase efforts of equity and inclusion in our schools. And that's one of the effects of HB 1084. And then you have the direct kind of implication that happened literally just a couple of months ago in August. At the beginning of August, literally like a week before classes started, the state superintendent essentially said that advanced placement African American studies would no longer be offered in the state of Georgia. Question? Yes. So there was a whole process behind this, and it essentially got reversed statewide. So AP African American Studies is now offered in the state of Georgia again, but there was like a 2-week saga that we went through this, and the ACLU of Georgia advocated with a lot of different partner organizations to try and get this decision overturned. Essentially, the state superintendent cited HB 1084 directly and said that the reason why AP African American Studies could not be offered in Georgia was because it violated HB 1084. Unfortunately, it seems as though the state superintendent did not fully read the language of HB 1084 because there was specifically an advanced placement exception written into the law. So of the divisive concepts and the divisive concepts that are not to be instructed or discussed in classrooms, the bill also said, yes, these divisive concepts are forbidden. However, we'll let it slide for AP classes. So AP African American Studies should have never been an experience that happened. This should have never been something that occurred in the classrooms. And it really did create a lot of scrambling and upheaval for students and for educators literally a week before classes were supposed to start. There were students who had this course in their course schedule. It's a year-long course. It's offered through College Board. It's completely legit. And it just threw all of the monkey wrenches in so many aspects for educators and for teachers. And again, citing HB 1084 specifically for the ability to remove this course. I will also note that of all of the AP courses that are offered in the state of Georgia, out of all the ethnic diversity courses that are offered in the state of Georgia, AP African American Studies is the only course in the state with this experience. The only course that has had this experience. So I'll just leave that there and let you all deduce from that what you may. SB 226, the book banning bill, we've seen the effects of this bill in the years since 2022, and that there have been widespread book bans across the state. What we started seeing was that the book bans were occurring in schools, and they were happening loudly and quietly. So there were people the school districts were required by SB 226 to have their process for book removals completed by a certain time. And parents at these schools began using the implemented process to challenge books that were available in the library. To no one's surprise, the majority of the books that have been banned and removed from school libraries here in Georgia are books that have LGBTQ plus characters or are written by LGBTQ plus authors or center Black and other ethnically diverse experiences and authors. The books that are non-controversial in that they center whiteness or they center heterosexuality or cisgenderism are not the ones that are being banned. Typically, we see that otherness and minority experiences are the ones that are disproportionately affected by book bans. So much so that an educator in Cobb County lost her job for reading a book last year called My Shadow is Purple. Her students asked her to read this book. It is a children's book, and somehow, it got back to parents that this book was read, and it was determined that the educator violated the law by reading this book, and she is now in active litigation to try and fight this decision. And this is something that book bans and censorship have real implications and real consequences on people's lives. This educator literally has lost her livelihood as a result of reading a book that is, for all intents and purposes, appropriate and, again, requested by her students. But the real issue with classroom censorship and book bans is the impact that it has on our students, the ones that are learning, the ones that come to school to get an education, to get a robust education and be exposed to a variety of ideas and experiences. There is a concerted effort to diminish that. And these bills, just specifically in Georgia, we're not even talking about, in other states. And because I will say, I guess proudly and also kind of sadly, that Georgia isn't even the worst off in terms of states that are dealing with these censorship issues. So it's not something that is exclusive to Georgia, but sadly, Georgia is being affected by these types of legislation. Lastly, HB 1178, within the Parents' Bill of Rights, there was a section specifically focused on sex education. I think this is something that's always controversial and something that parents, probably from the beginning of time, have gone back and forth about the best way to educate our students on sex education. And there's currently scrutiny for right now on the sex education curriculum in a number of school districts across Georgia. There are a few different curriculum plans, sex education curriculum that are offered that school districts can either use or not. Some of them are based in abstinence, some of them are based in just sex education in general, and safety and autonomy. And there are, and also incorporated in that is the conversation of gender. So again, LGBTQ plus issues always kind of come up in these censorship conversations, trying to censor the experiences and realities of the fact that there's a spectrum of people with different gender identities and sexual orientations, even in our schools. That's something that a lot of people don't want to face and don't want to kind of grasp the reality of, but young people, there are young people who are familiar and know what they like and what they don't like, and how they identify and how they don't. And having the representation, whether that be in books, in education, or in simply learning the correct language for their physical anatomy, and being able to use actual accurate terminology for the ways that their feelings and their attractions. These are all very important things that the state of Georgia has deemed unimportant and is trying to censor. So that is the quick and dirty on classroom censorship and book bans. We hope that you enjoy your kits. There are a lot of great banned books in there. And yes, we will take questions. Yes, ma'am.
Is there, seeing that up there, Georgia's not ranked that high overall as far as schools are concerned. Countrywide for the education. I forget what it's called now because I'm no longer a mom, but you know how parents can go in and look up the ranking of the schools and there's like 10 different things.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, Georgia's not that high. And then with this, as you said, it's limiting the children's education and their exposure to the world. Is there a way to litigate the Board of Education for the decisions made that in a way are crippling or handicapping our children as far as being able to compete for jobs and for colleges based on what this restrictive curriculum that they're trying to divide, and in fact also human rights as far as wanting to white out the LBQs, I call it the ABC because I can't remember them all, and minority presence, not just in Georgia but in this country, and the contributions that they have made. I mean, people, they think Alexander Graham Bell was the reason why we had a telephone. But they forget about the black assistant who made a ring. You see what I'm saying? So our children are being handicapped by what is occurring here. And I'm not sure what ACLU is doing. So if this in no way is a diamond, you're not doing your job or anything like that. I'm truly interested in questioning why isn't there a solidified lawsuit? And I would sue the state of Georgia as well as the state of Georgia Board of Education in doing this. Because it cannot happen without the executive part of the government as well as this agency, the school board.
That's a great question. And first, we don't take any offense to that question. Our go-to is always, what are we doing and what can we do? We're actively exploring ways to litigate, specifically HB 1084. The courts in the court system and just the principles guiding litigation make it somewhat difficult to be able to sue on this issue, particularly because depending on the grounds that the lawsuit is brought on, you have to be able to show a clear harm. So to your point about showing that there's disadvantages, in terms of being college ready and things like that, that's essentially a long game question. And it's one that you kind of have to wait and see what the outcomes really look like. You can't litigate something and say that there's a harm before the harm actually occurs.
No, I agree with that. However, I'm not saying sue in the state of Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go to the state Supreme Court. Now, and there are studies, not with the U.S., but South Africa, for instance. They had 3 Board of Education for the blacks who could only be educated up to the 6th grade because their Board of Education philosophy was you do not raise hope into people. You raise them to the station that they can aspire to once their education is over with. All they need to do is learn how to speak Afrikaans, how to serve their masters, and it works. So they only got to I don't think the 6th level is like the 8th level here, so like the 4th level in school. Then you had the colors, who could go high school and limited to whether or not they could go, say, to the university of his father's family. You know, so there are studies out there already about how divisive Board of Education can be and how they limit their students and their craft. South Africans had to escape their country in order to get educated.
Right.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No. Let me just address a point that you have raised.
And honey, please forgive me.
That's okay. You can't hear me. Or you're
Right.
having some difficulty hearing.
Right.
Your question was premised on the notion that this book ban is going to impact education of American children. But guess what? I've got news for you. Even before the ban, this country has always been ranked really very low.
Oh, I know.
So all this means is that things are going to get worse.
More harm.
Okay.
And that's the reason why I say it's not the state. We should be going into state court. We should be going into the United States, the Supreme Court, with this. And it could be, and if the decision is seminal, that'll set a precedent for us to go state by state by state.
Well, unfortunately, we have a Supreme Court that's not very amenable to these types of decisions anyway. But yeah, right. But there are ways locally that we can be involved. We can go to our state legislators and have these conversations. We can advocate. The Gold Dome is always open for us to go and have these conversations with the people who actually make the decisions here for us in Georgia and our students here in Georgia. But thank you so much for your question, and thank you all for being here. Hope you learned something at Freedom School, and I'll pass it back to Fallon.